Let's. All right. I remembered for once without a prompt. So, welcome. We're going to talk about economic development. Let me take you back to my handy dandy PowerPoint here. And economic development is something that governments pursue all over the place in different ways. We're going to talk about some of those ways, some of which appear to work better than others. There's really no magic wand for this. I was just reading something today about a project in Wisconsin pushed by a Taiwanese firm called Foxconn that was supposed to produce, thousands of jobs with millions in income. And what do you know? It's not happening. So, but we'll come back to that. So, why economic development is so important? More jobs means more income, means fewer social problems, means more tax revenue, means less demand for government services. So it's win, 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 win. And if we just look at US states, which make kind of a handy little set of data points for us, we find that the states that have higher incomes tend to have better quality of life scores, and everybody's happier. And we'll come back to that because there are various ways in which people try to measure these things, and particularly when it comes to US states, it's not always what it seems to be. So one of the challenges that we face, however, is that, and especially in our state without an income tax, is that if we get, manufacturing warehouse jobs, we get better wages, but we get less tax revenue. And if we have more retail service jobs, we get more tax revenue, but the wages aren't as good. So if we just consider our own little burg of Des Moines here, if you think back to 2007 and the old airport, the old Port of Seattle property up there by the post office and the senior center, there was going to be a Costco and a Target, and those aren't bad employers. Costco certainly pays all right, so that would have been good. But in any case, the point is that the FAA regional headquarters, which went there instead, because that original deal fell through along with the Great Recession, the financing dried up, those things didn't get built. Had they been built, the city's financial problems would have largely gone away. That would have just generated a lot more tax revenue. The jobs wouldn't have been as good. So while having the FAA is great in terms of high-paying jobs, granted, probably not a lot of new jobs for Des Moines residents, but on the other hand, it doesn't generate as much in the way of taxes. So this is what economic development looks like usually. This applied to, I think, developing countries, but some of this stuff is still relevant to us, particularly privatization and deregulation is often sold as a panacea. We will get cheaper government and better government. But in fact, research shows that privatization really doesn't save any money and the service isn't as good. Effective tax collection is important, and that's a problem that the United States faces. We have underfunded the IRS for so long that they don't do as good a job as they might. Development of manufacturing, that's on everybody's wish list. It just doesn't happen except for in particular circumstances. And then finally, investment in public services, which I tend to think is a good idea, but that by itself won't fix everything either. So if we look here, one of the things that's often proposed is tax cuts. Well, here is the tax cut that happened during the Trump years. And in fact, the blue is this is how the tax cut pans out over time. But if you look here consistently, the people who get the most money from it are in fact the top 1%. So the problem with tax cuts is that while they promise a lot of economic stimulus, they don't tend to deliver. And the reason they don't tend to deliver is that most of the money goes to the wealthiest Americans. I'm not an eat the rich sort of person, but the bottom line is that they simply don't spend enough to make the money trickle down. And a growing body of research shows that the wealth simply does not trickle down. So the other thing that tends to happen with tax cuts that makes them less effective is that they're often enacted during recessions. And under those circumstances, people get a little bit more money on their taxes back. They don't spend it. And spending is what makes the economy grow. They save it, they invest it, they pay off debt, and all of those things are fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Those are good for the economy, but in the short run, they won't stimulate growth. Now, another big promise is that, well, we will cut the red tape. We are overregulated, and if we can just get rid of the regulation, that will make the economy blossom. That doesn't seem to happen either, as we'll see when we look at the states in a minute. Regulation imposes both costs and benefits. It's neither all bad nor all good. So we can look at regulation as an expense in terms of what firms have to do to maintain safety. But of course, there's savings there if you have fewer injured workers on the job. So at best, it's a trade-off. So I don't tend to view that as something that's going to make everything better. Clearly, regulation can go too far. We have plenty of examples of that, but even less regulation isn't necessarily the answer. Now, recruiting big firms like Boeing, that's very popular. And in many other states, they're in a position to basically give firms money. You know, Wisconsin spent billions of dollars to get Foxconn to go there, and they're just not getting the payoff from it that was promised. And that just simply never happens. Firms tend to locate businesses for reasons that are not bad reasons, but they have to do with proximity to markets and availability of suppliers and availability of labor. Unless, of course, you're Boeing, which spent $900 million to move that plant, to open up that plant in South Carolina, to save $9 million a year in labor costs. One of their idiot executives even allowed that the reason they did this was to stick it to the machinists. The 787, as you know, was delayed by something like 3 years. And that was because Boeing scrapped the design build process that had worked so well with the 777. For several years, everything that got built in South Carolina had to be sent to Everett to get fixed, and now they're doing it all in South Carolina. I, at the time, infamously said, when somebody from TV Land asked, you know, why are you against this? I said, look, they're replacing people with an average of 20 years of experience with a functional equivalent of Walmart greeters. And that one quote was broadcast over and over and over again across the state of South Carolina. I got more nasty email than I've ever seen. People emailed my college president demanding that I be fired, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth of the matter is that Boeing couldn't attract enough workers. They had to recruit at trade schools all across the South just to get enough people to staff this factory. A few years back, they paid them a bonus, and the bonus was not because they'd done anything different other than get their work done on time for the first time. So one of the things that I'm increasingly stressing is that it might be time for us to think beyond Boeing, because I have no faith in the management of the company, and they don't seem to care about the people here as they once did. So that's a serious challenge, because that's an awful lot of good paying jobs. Nobody would kick out a firm like that. And people who say, well, we could get different employers, have no idea what they're talking about. That being said, it is difficult for us to count on them, as you saw with the 737 MAX debacle, where they cut costs, where they cut corners on safety to save money. I mean, ask those. I don't understand how some of those people are still working. If this company had any integrity at all, they'd be cleaning house. But oh well, what do I know? Here's what happens. This is sort of a regular rite of spring. All kinds of people and organizations, and especially magazines, publish business lists, right? Which state has the best business climate? And this seems to have something to do with tax rates. And so Texas apparently has the best business climate, according now. All of these states, most of them are in the South, and they have low taxes, and they have weak unionization rules, and they have less regulation. They also have much lower quality of life scores. You know, Texas leads the country in teen pregnancy. I don't think that's a point of pride. So the problem is that the so-called strong business climates, in fact, tend to lead to the lower quality of life scores. So debasing yourself in the face of business in hopes that they'll hire more people doesn't seem to be paying off for ordinary citizens. So it is something of a stroke of luck that the founding fathers of Washington made it so very difficult for governments here to just give money away in search of jobs. So here again, here's another one. How does your state rank on corporate taxes? Texas does not score very well in this survey. Every survey seems to come up with a different, ranking, a different result. As one guy I read said, look, these things are there to sell magazines. They don't represent actually good research. So when you hear this stuff, take it all with a grain of salt. Washington ranks number 44. I don't really understand how that is, because we don't have a corporate business tax. We have the B&O tax, which has all kinds of exceptions and is actually a fairly low rate of tax. And it seems to persist largely because it's good for big firms, and there are so many exceptions that even though it's still a major source of revenue for the state, it's not putting companies out of business. So, but then if we look at it a different way here, and I'm going to go to this one and come back to that one. So here again, this is U.S. News and World Report, which is a kind of publication. But in any case, they looked at all the states and said, which ones are best to live in? Hey, what do you know? We came out number one. And if we look down here, these states with the allegedly best business climates, those are not places where you want to live. A guy I've worked with for some years is retiring and moving to Georgia. And the first thing out of my mouth was, whatever for? Well, something for everybody, right? Now, one of the things that people look at by way of other than just giving away the store is the minimum wage. So we'll come back to that slide for a moment. And this is always sort of a mixed blessing. I mean, in just terms of sheer economic logic, if you raise the price of something, people tend to produce less of it. So one would expect that some employers will employ fewer people as a result of having to pay higher wages. Studies have shown, at least under current circumstances, in places where the minimum wage has been increased, that has not happened. And it has not happened in part because people all of a sudden making sort of enough money to live on in something other than abject poverty, they actually go out and spend the money, and that spurs demand and makes the economy grow. This won't always be true at all times and places, right? There are circumstances under which if we raise the minimum wage, we would lose jobs. That seemed to have happened way back in the 1960s. There was a hike in the minimum wage, and as a result, more than 1 million jobs were lost. It doesn't cause inflation. That's another complaint, is that, well, if we raised the minimum wage, it would cause inflation. That would only be true if the economy was already running at full tilt, right? If we were producing at capacity, so that increased demand would only serve to bid up prices. Well, that's clearly not true under current circumstances. So we have some wiggle room there. The minimum wage forces firms to redistribute income. Somebody there, if you could mute, please, that would be great.
Down the boulevard. The major waited until they were half a block closer before he pushed up the window and reached for the rocket launcher. The AT-4 was green, 40 inches long.
All righty, there we go. Let's go back to sharing the screen. Okay, so what else could we do? One of the usual tricks that people talk about is building infrastructure. So one thing to understand, and with my very young students who have no idea how anything works, I have to explain to them, cities don't go out and build malls and create businesses, et cetera, et cetera. Cities and counties and states and to some extent countries, they can create the conditions for economic growth, but they don't necessarily cause economic growth at their own. The bigger the government, the less true that is. But when we look at our local governments, really all they can do is sort of make it so that if business decides to come here or somebody opens a business, they have a better chance of succeeding. So infrastructure, roads and bridges and transportation facilities, all of these things can help. They provide employment up front, and they make the economy function more efficiently. So, for example, one of the good things that we did in terms of infrastructure, this is 20 years ago, if you think to, what is that street, 188th, 43rd down there by South Center, where they spent all that time and money making an underpass underneath the railroad. Some of you may recall that little spot there just south of the mall. And what that was for was the fast freight corridor. And what that means is that when containerized shipping comes into the port of Seattle, it can get on the train and get out of town in a hurry. That was a worthwhile investment that makes our port more competitive, and the port produces an awful lot of jobs, whatever else you might think about them. So, and they tend to be good jobs, family wage jobs. Now, another thing that comes up, another kind of infrastructure, and this is sort of interesting, is sports stadia and event centers. And studies have shown that big sports stadiums are a drag on the economy. I mean, there are reasons to have professional sports in your town, and for the most part, they don't have anything to do with economics. It's an entertainment option. There's nothing wrong with that. It enhances the cultural life of the area, but they don't produce a lot of jobs. They don't produce a lot of good paying jobs, and and really, they're not that busy. I mean, if you have a Major League Baseball team, they have what? 80 some home games a year. I mean, that's not very many events, is it? So here is Showware down in Kent, and this is an interesting example of how this can work. What's near there, of course, is Kent Station. All of these things have to be subsidized, right? Anybody builds one of these things and tells you it's going to pay for itself, they're either lying or stupid. And I do mean STOOPID, stupid, because they never do. And all three of these that we're going to look at have to be subsidized. In the case of Showware, because Kent Station is nearby, it drives a lot of business to Kent Station. And that's where the city of Kent makes back its money. They get sales tax from all those stores and restaurants, and they're busier because there are events at Showware. So that's worked out okay for them. And the land that they put this on was pretty much unused at that point. So it didn't displace too many jobs. Once upon a time, there was a board and chemical factory there, but I think this was gone by then. The city had sort of the foresight to buy this land, buy the land that Kent Station was on, find developers who were willing to put this up. But they do have to subsidize this, and they don't make any bones about that. Now, this is Town Toyota Center in Wenatchee, and this one is almost in some ways kind of comical. I interviewed the mayor of Wenatchee, who's also on the Public Facilities District Board, and he kind of hemmed and hawed, and he said, "Well, we get more events here than we would have gotten before, and that's not a bad thing." It very nearly went bankrupt, and the tragicomic part was all these arch conservative state legislators from the Wenatchee area coming to their colleagues in the House and Senate begging for a bailout. It's like, wait a minute, I thought you guys are Republicans. Shouldn't this thing pay for itself? They eventually found a way to sell new bonds and support it, but it's not paying for itself. It does generate some revenue in terms of taxes and also added economic activity. And the studies they do of these things tend to show, oh yeah, it's a good deal. If it gets close to breaking even and it provides more cultural opportunities for people, I think that's fine. But you can't talk about these things as, oh, this is going to, this is going to revitalize downtown, etc. We don't know that. Now, this one, the Performing Arts and Events Center in Federal Way, which is a lovely facility. it's still not paid for. You know, they thought they haven't managed to sell the naming rights. They thought they'd get more money from a tax credit that they didn't get very much money from. They did get some money from the state. The idea was, and you know, I credit the city for sort of taking an active approach. I'm going to pause for one moment here and deal with my now 16-year-old dog who's huffing and puffing and needs to go out. So we're just going to take a brief break and I will. Okay. Back to the Performing Arts and Events Center. So if you know anything about downtown Federal Way tried for 20 years to become a city, which didn't happen until the early 90s when they finally excluded the Redondo area, which ended up being part of Des Moines. And that was sort of an odd decision. But in any case, in the interim, Federal Ways, what would be Federal Ways downtown developed into one of the world's great giant strip malls, and then the malls went away, and there was, you know, vacant land and not pretty and chain link fences, and you know, there was no there, and the city officials realized that they needed to do something, or you know, this would just become sort of this post-industrial wasteland. And so the idea was buying land, building the Performing Arts and Events Center. And like I said, it's a lovely facility, and it's bringing in, once again, cultural opportunities that we might not have otherwise here in South King County, in the hopes that it would generate economic development around there. So they bought some other land, they put in a park, they they spent $3 million on steps to connect the park to the Performing Arts and Events Center. As one of my students said when the mayor was there a couple of years ago, you spent $3 million on stairs? I thought it was a fair question, but in any case, it hasn't paid off. In part, they bought some more land there, and they found a developer who was going to put up a hotel, and this would have been a great step in sort of this redevelopment effort. Somehow they didn't manage to get the development rights to this land, and the guy who still owns the development rights wants like another $3 million before it can be used. So it hasn't worked yet. I don't fault them for trying. If they manage to make happen what they would like to see happen, you'll get a lot of mixed use development in the area. Mixed use development is an idea whose time has really come. And what that means is that you have structures where you have perhaps retail and office space on the first floors, and then residential space above that. And that creates sort of a ready-made market and a ready-made customers for people in that area. It's what happens in the rest of the world, and it tends to lower crime because somebody's always there. So I wish them well with that. You know, anything that helps South King County is good in my book. Now, other things that we might do. So here's an idea. Bob Hasagawa, so state senator from Renton. He's an unrepentant FDR liberal, and he thinks we should have a state bank. They have a state bank in North Dakota. North Dakota, having gone totally Republican, has so hamstrung its state bank. You can open an account there, but they don't issue credit cards. They finance some state operations, and that's Senator Hasagawa's idea that if we had a state bank, we could use that to our benefit to finance things and save the people of the state some money by having earnings from this bank. I don't think it's a bad idea. Whether it will happen, I don't know. It's Washington, so we've had a study, and I bet we'll have some more studies before we're done. But Senator Bob keeps pushing for that. Now, here's a less obvious thing. I proposed this at a policy conference once, and everyone thought I was nuts. But state parks. State parks generate a lot of revenue, as we talked about a month ago when we talked about state agencies. This is Palouse Falls. I've never actually been there, but I'm not sure it's worth driving to Pullman. But, you know, State parks generate a lot of money in terms of ancillary economic activity. People spend money when they go to visit them. If they were adequately funded, that would produce jobs. And the great thing about state parks as an engine of economic development is that the parks are in oftentimes rural areas, and those are the hardest folks to help. So I mean, if I was the god of economic development in Washington State, I'd fully fund the parks and then some, because I think that would help. This has worked out well for us. Tourism is always sort of a mixed bag, because it does generate tax revenues, but the jobs that it creates are not always high paying, and of course they're seasonal. So the cruise industry has generated a lot of economic activity in Washington State. The Port of Seattle has done well with this. People come here, and before and after the cruise, they're dropping millions of dollars into our economy. This is not a bad thing. Eco friends of mine tend to look down their noses at the cruise industry. They say it doesn't benefit everyone equally, and it does generate some environmental concerns. So that's something to be worked on. Now, tourism sometimes can work almost too well. This is Leavenworth, and if you've been there, it's this fake Bavarian town. It's really lovely. It's a lovely setting. How this happened was a couple of guys from California bought a restaurant outside of town, and they thought something's got to happen here. And they stumbled across a town in California that had done this by turning themselves into some kind of Danish wonderland. Well, they did have a bunch of Danish settlers, so there was some a precedent for this. In the case of Leavenworth, it was simply a dying mining and timber town. And so they adopted this. The interesting thing about it is that in normal times, Leavenworth gets more tourists than the country of Iceland. Now, granted, Leavenworth is easier to get to, but they get an extraordinary number of people coming there. If you go there, you will see tour buses full of people who are probably from all over the world. There's nothing Bavarian about it other than the requirement of the buildings, but it's not bad. It's pretty. There's some good restaurants. There are wineries. There's a distillery. There's skiing and hiking and whatnot nearby, and lots of places to stay. On the other hand, so for example, a couple of years back, we went up there for the tree lighting ceremony in December, and there were so many people right about what we're looking at, right? It was wall to wall human beings. And when the tree lighting ceremony finally ended, we did not physically move for 15 minutes. And eventually we got to our car, and then it took us 90 minutes to drive 4 miles to the place where we were staying. And as someone has asked who was writing about this, why are they still spending thousands and thousands of dollars a year to promote tourism when they've got basically all the people they can handle? Honestly, if you wanted to go to Leavenworth in normal times, April's great. There's hardly anybody there. If you go in summer, if you go in fall, if you go through the Christmas season, it's just packed. It is just totally packed, but it's worked well for them. The challenge that they face, and I have talked to people who live and work there, the problem is that the people who work there cannot afford to live there. And so they have a real challenge with that. The local hospital keeps losing nurses because they can go to Wenatchee and make so much more money. So it's always a mixed blessing, right? Aspen, Colorado, I gather for a long time was the same way. They needed people there to work the tourist season. None of them could afford to live there. It was just too expensive. So this is a kind of overlooked thing. The arts. Arts funding turns out to generate an awful lot of money. We still in Seattle sell more theater and arts tickets than we do sports tickets. And the great thing about arts funding is that the money stays here. A theater company, unlike, say, an airplane company, granted they don't pay nearly as well, they're not going to up and move away to greener pastures because this is where their customers are. So arts funding tends to pay great dividends. People look at that and say, well, that subsidy, they should be able to support themselves. Really, if it pays for itself in terms of generating income and tax revenue, I think that's not a bad investment. Now, another thing that has been tried with some success, of course, is education and training. And the difference seems to be here training people for jobs that actually exist. So you can't just train anybody for anything. You sort of have to figure out what are the labor needs within your community and train people to do that. So these folks, of course, are being trained to go out on the road as the Pillsbury Doughboy, and I hope that worked out for them well. So now this is an interesting thing that I stumbled across. Port Townsend, lovely town, also a bit tourist dependent. Once again, things that I like, hiking and wineries and distilleries and great restaurants. They had this store, and it was sort of hardware and outdoor gear and that kind of stuff, and it went out of business, and people in town got together and pooled their money and created this community-owned store. And it operates, and it's been operating for several years. It's a great store. It's full of great brands. It's not universally popular with the other business people, but it's a going concern. So it is possible for communities to pool their resources and supply the things that they need. So, I mean, one of the reasons we like to go to Port Townsend is go in October when they have their sale, and that's kind of fun. Another thing that an idea whose time has come is urban agriculture. And this is happening in cities all over the country. This kind of stuff was literally discouraged by some cities. Zoning is always sort of a mixed blessing, but people are having success growing food in urban areas that would be otherwise sort of unused, and that produces jobs and income, but also provides better food for people who live in the neighborhood. Now, this is an example in our own town that is related to that. Another kind of thing that generates a lot of revenue is farmers markets. And this, of course, is our own Des Moines Farmers Market, which in normal times, once again, is in many ways the best restaurant in town, right? A lot of places discourage farmers markets, but they do generate money. They're actually environmentally friendly because it means your food is quite likely traveling a lot less to get to your plate. Average bite of food is estimated to travel 1,500 miles. Well, if you're buying locally, you're addressing that problem. And of course, the quality can be pretty good. Some people carped a few years back, right, that QFC had left because they were being put out of business by the farmers market. It's like, really? Did you go in that QFC? They had an entire row of nothing but bottled water. That ought to tell you they weren't selling the things they were supposed to be selling. So trying to keep the jobs at home. The Washington State ferry system, some years back, legislators finally realized that buying ferries from Louisiana was just a lose-lose situation. They had to get shipped all the way here. You were saving money up front, but losing money on the back end. If you had the ferries built by local shipyards, that keeps the jobs and money at home. And some people quibble about this every once in a while. I think it's still working pretty good. The biggest challenge that we face is that there aren't many shipyards that qualify, and that apparently has to do with whether they have appropriate apprenticeship programs or not. That's something that clearly needs to be looked at, but that's a challenge. Maybe the answer there is that you help these other firms start apprenticeship programs. Port districts alone among state governments in Washington State are able to sort of move a little money in the direction of private businesses that I think might be a good task for them. So something to think about there. Now, let's say we manage to get economic growth. We come to the paradox of growth. This is the whole reason I have a doctorate, right? My one single idea in the enormity of my miserable life. states, communities, cities, counties, everybody tries like heck to grow economically. And then what happens? Sometimes they succeed. And then all of a sudden you have higher housing prices and more traffic and overcrowded schools. And is your tax system up to snuff to take advantage of this economic growth? Washington's, of course, is uniquely not situated for this. And then you try to manage the growth. And the problem with this is that the things you can do to control growth impact the people who are here every bit as much as the people you were trying to chase away. If I had to choose between these two problems, abject poverty or the paradox of growth, I would choose the paradox of growth. It's much easier to manage growth than it is to manage contraction. But that being said, I think my overall message is that we need to continue to think creatively about other ways of spurring the economy, not just in the urban areas, but in the rural areas, especially. Those folks count in my book. And it's not going to be about recruiting big businesses or continuing to give away the state to Boeing. I've lost faith in them, as you can have no doubt probably guessed by now. So anyway, that's what I know in exactly 39 minutes, which leaves us some time for your probing and trenchant questions. Thank you, friends. As you can tell, I had my nap today. I'm on a roll. Yes, John.
TM, yeah.
Yeah.
Does the FAA pay a significant amount of tax to the city of Des Moines?
There's some utility tax and some leaseholder tax, but it is, it's generating some revenue for the city, but not nearly as much as if they'd managed to get the Target and the Costco there. The city manager of Renton once told me they literally got more money from the IKEA store than they got from the Boeing plant. And that is sort of the development dichotomy, as I call it, that, the industries that are going to give you tax revenue so you can provide the services people say they want don't produce the jobs that allow people to live comfortable lives. I'm not saying those jobs aren't important. I think there's dignity in all labor. I'm never going to look down my nose at somebody who's working, trying to do something. But in terms of managing a community, it's a big trade-off there. So yeah, the FAA center does not generate a lot of money, and so far it hasn't, sort of, as far as I can tell. I mean, somebody needs to go up there and open a lunch restaurant, right? There's all those folks there. I think there's a way. There was talk about, we're going to run a shuttle downtown so they can go eat. It's like, that's a pipe dream. That's not convenient. That's 30 minutes of maybe your 45-minute lunch break riding a bus to downtown and back. So that's something that hasn't happened that needs to happen, I think.
How about these big warehouses that fill up the whole city of Kent? And also we have some share of warehouses outside the FAA.
We do, and it is much the same story. In the case of Kent, when the state a few years back adopted what they called streamlined sales tax, and the sales tax began to be collected at the point of sale as opposed to the point of distribution. And so Kent's tax revenues just absolutely crashed. I mean, they started calling it the fiscal cliff, and the last two mayors and city councils have really had to struggle to make up that difference. It punched a real hole in their business. But that being said, even without, so that worked okay for Ken until the sales tax regime got changed. They tend to produce better jobs. I mean, that's one thing. It's simply true. What between Auburn and Tukwila is one of the largest concentrations of industrial and warehouse space in the world. And, that's generated a lot of good jobs. Trade-offs, as always. The Green River Valley, some of the most fertile farmland into the world, most of it's now under 6 feet of gravel and concrete and asphalt. So it was decidedly a mixed blessing.
Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. Other questions? Yes.
I was thinking the Highline School District never got much money from the port. And I understand that the port in Tacoma gives money to the Fife school district.
Probably, yeah. Well, the thing about the port giving money to the school district is, as long as there were lawsuits over the third runway, they that sort of gummed up the works as far as that goes. I mean, Highline College, we're a state agency. We are almost alone in South King County in not trying to sue the bejesus out of the port. And as a consequence, every time we put up a building or remodel one, they come in and spend a couple $1,000,000 on insulation. As I'm sure I've said before, when I first taught there, you could be in the basement of a building, and if a plane flew overhead, you had to stop. No one could hear themselves. You couldn't hear yourself talk. You couldn't hear your students. And now you wouldn't know there were planes there. The other problem for the Highline School District was sort of a lack of planning. They literally built some schools in the flight path. I think over time that's gotten better, but I'm in the minority. I know people get really mad about the airport here. And my usual response is, there's been an airport here since 1944. Why did you move here? It's like people who move to the country and then complain that the cows are noisy and smell. It's like, this is the real world and it's not all about you. On the other hand, city officials, local officials have often complained to me saying, oh, they just don't like dealing with the port. They didn't trust them. And in fact, once in a while, they're a bit squirrely. I mean, I sat through 2 years of hearings about what to do in lieu of a third runway. And indeed, they said, if we build a third runway, it will only be used in case of inclement weather. And then later they claimed that they had not said that. It's like, I was there. And I finally got somebody to admit, yeah, apparently somebody did say that. It's like, yeah, they said that a lot. So my late wife used to say when a plane came up 12th Avenue, they'd say, oh, she'd say inclement weather because skies were clear. So anyway.
My other question along that same line, why does the Port of Seattle not pay money rather than take taxes?
Okay, I can address that, and that's an interesting question. So if you look at some other ports on the West Coast, they only do the things that make them money up front. What the Port of Seattle argues, and I'm inclined to believe them on this one, is that they take the property tax revenue and leverage it into doing things that generate more economic activity for the community. So the property tax is an investment in the kinds of things that the port does. And there are thousands and thousands of well-paying jobs as a result of us being a port city. So however much we might like it, these are jobs that would be hard to replace. So I don't begrudge them that. I have heard people say, some guy who used to be the mayor of Bellevue, he said, well, we should really turn the waterfront into condos and restaurants, and that would be nicer. It's like, that's not going to generate the kinds of jobs that we have. The port's not pretty, but man, those jobs pay pretty well. That keeps bread on a lot of people's tables, and that keeps everything else working. I just think that if people have good jobs, our social problems tend to be less, and the data that I see, I think, repeats that. But that's why they have the property tax, and other ports don't, and they don't do as much. So, other questions?
Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, Joe.
You didn't mention the agriculture and the wine industry. How does that fit into our state development program?
Wine is a big industry in Washington State. We are the second leading producer of wine in the United States. California's #1. We're quite a bit behind them, but really nobody else is even close, right? And we have something on the order of 1,000 wineries now. So it employs a lot of people. Most of the wineries are still pretty small. So they're producing, say, 2,000 cases a year. There's a handful of really big wineries. Some of them do export around the world. The best bottle of wine I've had in my life was in China. It was a Chateau Saint Michel Cab Reserve. And after some weeks of drinking Dynasty, otherwise known as Dynasty, was like, this is awesome. And I shared it with my Chinese friends and they went, wow, this is awesome. So it's a big industry in terms of employment. Its impact is not that huge. You wouldn't want to make it go away. I mean, that's a classic example of in trade of what's called comparative advantage. It makes sense to grow grapes here. We have the right climate and terroir and water and all the things that we need. And we are uniquely situated in terms of access to world markets. So we're a day closer to Asia than other West Coast ports. So that works to our advantage as well. It's like apples. It's important and there's a lot of money there. It's not actually that big. Agriculture as a whole is something like the second largest economic sector in the state. So that's something we need to continue to pay attention to. And of course, that really helps the other parts of the state. I mean, Puget Sound tends to do okay. What I worry about is the other parts of the state. You want them to do as well. They'll be happier. Things will work better. So we lead the world in production and the country, and sometimes the world in production of an amazing range of crops, hops, and we lead the country in growing sweet corn. I mean, the kind of stuff you get in your can, right? Obviously, all kinds of fruits. The only place that grows more apples than Washington State is the country of China. So that's quite a comparison there. Hay is a big product. We ship a lot of hay to Asia, and this is in part because somebody realized, hey, we have all these containers that come over with products from Asia, and they're going back empty. What if we fill them up with hay? So we're shipping dead grass to Asia because one, the containers are available and the ships are going back anyway. And two, of course, they have less room to simply grow that kind of stuff for livestock operations there. So.
But how does it contribute to the welfare of the state outside of providing a few jobs and some export?
The wineries?
The agriculture in general.
Agriculture. Well, it employs a lot of people. There's a lot of small businesses. There are, what did I read? Something like at least 100 farms in every county in the state. So it's still a big industry, and it generates. It's something like $15 billion a year in economic activity. So there's a chunk of change involved there. Yeah, I mean, the difference is, see, you look at a Boeing plant and you can see, well, there's 20,000 people working there, and you know what that is, right? Well, if you have 100 small farms, or 1,000 small farms, there might be 20,000 people working there, but you don't notice that as obviously. I mean, people tend to lose sight of that. They'll see that big companies are laying off, and what they may miss is that, really most of the job growth and the innovation and all the stuff that actually happens comes from small businesses. So supporting small businesses, I think, is very important. People say, well, we shouldn't be picking winners and losers. But look, I mean, venture capitalists, when they invest in firms, they hope to hit one bet out of 10. Right. So, I mean, if you applied that kind of standard to some way of helping existing firms in Washington State, and it wouldn't necessarily be giving them money, you could give them money for something, right? Then that, I think, would be a fair test. Yes, Heinz.
Would you address the point of minimum wage? I would think that minimum wage decided by the government is counterintuitive.
Well, I did talk about that a minute ago, but I'm happy to talk about it again. Minimum wage, you can write it minimum wage laws in such a way that truly small businesses that would be disadvantaged by having to pay more are excluded from that, right? We're thinking more about enormously profitable corporations that don't pay their workers a living wage. I mean, Walmart, for example, trains its employees on how to apply for public assistance. As a meme I saw the other day that I thought was very clever. Somebody said, you know, I can't hire anybody because they make more money on unemployment. And the response was, what an interesting way of saying you pay your workers starvation wages. So if you write this in a way that firms that really could afford it could spread the wealth a little bit more, that doesn't end private enterprise, but it does make them treat their employees with some sort of minimum of compassion. And what they find is that employees stay longer, they get sick less. This was fascinating. They did this a year or so ago in Sacramento. They gave a bunch of people sort of just a minimum wage subsidy, right? They just said, all right, we're going to give you this money. And people went out and found better jobs, right? Their lives improved immeasurably, not because they had more money, but because they had sort of the leeway to take some chances, to get some training, to improve themselves. That's something that we're likely to run into. That what I keep reading is, and what I keep seeing is, if your job can be done by a robot, someday it will be, in which case you can't just have a bunch of people starving together. And that's why people are starting to talk about something that came up way back in the 70s under Nixon, of all people, a guaranteed minimum annual income. And then, of course, I mean, there's all kinds of issues that go along with that, but we may down the road have to look at something like that, because if people don't have incomes, trouble ensues. And that's not good. And that's not good. So you can't just raise the minimum wage willy-nilly at all times. In the circumstances under which we are at present, I think it is not a bad idea. And it certainly hasn't made the sky fall in our own state. So, but you do have to pay attention to, are you excluding firms that really are small and really can't afford this? You know, you can't go out to a diner in the middle of nowhere and say, okay, thou shalt now pay much higher wages, but you could go to Home Depot or Lowe's or something like that. I mean, these corporations are phenomenally profitable. They could afford to pay more. So I think.
So is our government doing that?
Some states are doing that. If we went back and looked at that map, we'd see that there are different minimum wages in states all across the country. And of course, the states that have the lower quality of life scores are also the states with the lower minimum wage. I don't think those two things are disconnected. Yes.
Where are the states with the higher income?
Where are the states with higher incomes?
There were some states.
Yeah, and in the West and the Northeast, the states with the allegedly worst business climates are the states where it's just better to live because everything's working better. And you have less crime, and you have less drug abuse, and you have less teenage pregnancy. I mean, just, take your pick. A colleague of mine in graduate school did this with just the counties in Washington. And the counties with the lowest incomes were the counties that had the most social problems. People have money. Things tend to take care of themselves.
How about the Midwest?
It varies quite a bit. Kansas, for example, has a certain amount of problems. Kansas is an interesting example of tax cuts. So they have a very conservative Republican governor there, Sam Brownback, and some years back he pushed through really steep cuts in the income tax. And he said, look, if we do this, the economy will blossom and it'll pay for itself. And in fact, it meant that they kept having to cut school funding and cut all kinds of programs because, of course, it wasn't generating more tax revenue. It was not paying for itself. And eventually the Republican-dominated legislature overrode the governor's veto and raised the taxes because they just said, look, Holmes, this isn't working. He was once considered as a Republican frontrunner for the presidency, but his star seems to have faded. So, other questions?
Tim?
Hi, Shirley.
Yeah, hi. I understand that the property next door to us, the Masonic place,
the Landmark,
is now owned by the owners or the developers of Kent Station.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's the last we heard.
Okay, that's a good one.
So that's going to make kind of a difference. But I guess they've only gotten as far as having a committee to decide what to do.
Yeah. The landmark is that's just a fascinating. I mean, it's such a lovely building, and it has some really cool stuff inside, of course. Unfortunately, the rooms are not en suite, so it would not be a quick turnaround into a hotel because nobody's going to stay in a hotel anymore that doesn't have a bathroom. And I'm sure that there are asbestos issues in a building that old. And of course, this is Des Moines, and this is modern America. I mean, I go on every time my students write a story about this for the Thunderword, the college newspaper. The stuff people say is just amazing. They're like, "Oh no, I don't want that developed. There'll be more traffic." And there's one person who says, "I think it should be turned into a children's museum." I'm like, "How do you pay for that? How does that work?" So other developers have looked at it and concluded it was more money than they wanted to spend. The city has, of course, an interest in seeing it preserved, at least the way it looks. If you had nothing but money, you could probably make this work. I know what I'd do with it, with all those spaces and facilities inside. The number that gets kicked around is something like $20 million to refurbish the building, but that number is not apparently based on any actual evidence. What other people have told me, it's just that somebody said that once and now it's accepted as gospel, is that's what it would take to redevelop it. The Kent Station owners, now that's just one I haven't heard before. I don't doubt you, Shirley, but that's quite fascinating. My students have attempted to contact the people who own it and have not received any response. Certainly, traffic impacts would be something that you'd have to think about. The neighbors would not be thrilled.
And we're the neighbors.
And you're the neighbors, right? Yes. Well, who knows? Maybe it'll be a casino and you can just go and spend your children's inheritance there. I would sure like it to become something that would be of value to the community. Forgive me if I'm not in favor of the Children's Museum, but people suggest things like that. And I think, hey, how's that going to work? Where's that pennies from heaven? I mean, how are you going to pay for that? So, and the city still needs stuff, right? The old city council made it so hard to do business here, and they relied on the sales tax equalization fund. And when that went away, we had nothing. I mean, Des Moines still has pretty much the worst per capita tax base of any city over 10,000 in the entire state. I mean, the only places that have tax bases as bad as ours are like dying towns in Eastern Washington. So it's like we're number 0. Yes, Joe.
It seems like I hear a lot of people talking about political activity in the city of Seattle, doing things and adopting policies that are anti-business. How do they expect to survive and pay for their?
It's sort of like when you go to a restaurant when the economy is booming and the service is terrible, because everybody has jobs and the people they have to hire really aren't very good at being servers. So I think there's nothing in Seattle that won't be fixed by a good recession. Now, I don't say that with any joy because recessions hurt people's lives in the short term, but I expect that eventually that pendulum will swing back. They're on the other end of the paradox of growth, right? They've got money and the city's got economic activity and rising property values, and on the whole, it's not a bad place. And when that happens, people tend to presume that everything is as it always will be. It's like babies. You will remember this from your own time as parents. When a baby cries because something has hurt it, I mean, oh my gosh, the depth, the angst, just the sheer horror of those cries, because the baby has so little experience, it thinks, oh my God, the rest of my life is going to be nothing but pain. And then you get older and you figure it out, now that'll go away, right? Well, people tend to look at the state of the economy in those terms. If we're in a recession, This is apparently the new normal and this will last forever, despite having lived through multiple recessions. Same thing with booms. We're in a boom. We look at that and we go, aha, we've reached a permanent level of prosperity. And legitimate economists have said that multiple times. When you hear that, it's time to grab your wallet and run. But ultimately, I think that will sort itself out, and people will decide, I hope, that a little more balance is in order. And it's a little concerning that there's sort of nobody on the city council with anything like business experience. But that's a problem in city governments everywhere. I mean, I really do think you ought to have a balance, right? You can't just ignore the poor people and the social problems. But by the same token, you can't just ignore, the business owners. And there has to be a place at the table for everybody. So if they go too far, they'll know soon enough, and then the pendulum will swing back.
You think then that it will be politically driven, this recession?
Oh, no. Recessions are caused by much bigger forces than what the city council decides. So probably something else happens in the economy and we have a recession, and then everybody goes, oh my God, the sky is falling and we need to do something different. And then all of a sudden people care about jobs again. It's a uniquely Washington thing. I expect this happens elsewhere, but we really do seem to manage by crisis. We manage from crisis to crisis. And so whatever the next crisis is, then we'll get people to move. A guy told me once, it's a former state official, he said, back east, they know this is the land of process. I mean, if you just look at how long it took us to replace the viaduct, any other part of the country, they would have done that inside of a year. And for us, studies and votes and everything. And some decades later, we managed to replace it before it collapsed, which was something of a miracle in and of itself. Other questions? All right. Well, you are all great Americans. I'm very glad to be with you. I'm excited that I get to see you next month. I'll try to figure out something else to talk about. We every month we're together, I feel like I have now reached the limits of my ignorance, so I'm gonna have to learn something new, I guess. So thank you, friends. Be well, stay safe, and I will see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. See you.